My name is Jessica Hellmann, and I'm the director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota and a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. Well, today we're going to talk about a global problem and how it affects living things on Earth. This is a global problem that the whole world has been trying to solve for a number of years, and especially of late. It's a global problem in the media today. In fact, in December of this past year, in 2015, the world came together to reaffirm its commitment to keep this global problem as small as we can manage in the Paris negotiations and the signing of a Paris Agreement in December 2015. Before I talk a little bit about how climate change, this is the global problem to which I'm referring, but how climate change affects life on Earth, let's talk about how much climate change we might experience, and let's use as a starting point that recent current event. What amount of climate change might the Paris Agreement have us see? So let's step back in time a little bit, back to December 2015 into Paris, France. The thing that was most prominently covered in the media during the Paris negotiations was this sentence. The overall goal for the Paris Agreement was to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C, hopefully maybe even below 1.5 degrees C, above the modern historic average global temperature. So we confirmed yet again as a global community that we're going to not allow climate to change, increase more than 2 degrees C. Now, how do we go about accomplishing that? We accomplish that using something called Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs. INDCs were the gifts that every country brought to the Paris negotiations. They were voluntary commitments toward reaching this global goal. Well, it turns out the Paris Agreement has something to say about these voluntary agreements as well. I'll show this text. The Paris negotiations ultimately had to come to terms with the fact that if you added up, if you aggregated the greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and 2030, which is when those INDCs mature. So by the time those INDCs come fully into play, that is not enough. The sum total of those voluntary commitments do not fall within the least cost 2 degrees C scenario. And that is noted with great concern. However, or what that implies then is after 2025, after 2030, when these come to fruition, maybe even beforehand, the world will have to achieve much greater emission reduction efforts. So much greater emission reduction efforts will be required than those in the INDCs if we're to achieve that 2 degrees C goal. So let's take that as a backdrop. 2 degrees C as a possible goal. In fact, what's interesting about that 2 degrees C warming is we're only halfway there. We've experienced about 1 degree C warming compared to the historic background rate. And if we're not careful, if we don't increase our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we could exceed that 2 degree goal. So now let's zoom down from that global conversation about targets and greenhouse gas mitigation and talk about what these impacts mean here in Minnesota, climate change impacts and management strategies, or maybe why you should care and what you could do here in Minnesota as a natural resource manager. In my presentation today, I really kind of want to cover 5 different topics. First, let's remind ourselves how important climate is in determining where things live. And let's remind ourselves what typically happens when the climate changes in the past, or what has happened in the past to living things when the climate changes. And I'll emphasize the fact that moving is often a dominant response. Then let's start imagining what management options are available to us to confront those consequences. Talk about an idea known as adaptive capacity and using that idea, talk about some strategies that might be available to us in the biodiversity conservation world to maximize that adaptive capacity. And then lastly, I want to take just a few moments and talk about what it means when we have novel communities or new combinations of species together in the landscapes that were historically something different. So the world is changing. I alluded already that under the Paris Agreement we might be tolerating, in fact we've agreed to tolerate 2 degrees C, of which we are halfway there. But let's just for a moment, even though we all maybe know, or in this webinar we're not really discussing the science of climate change per se, but let's remind ourselves of what the magnitude of climate change can mean for living things. So in this slide you will see, this is a business as usual scenario. So this is a more extreme outcome. This is if we were not successful at Paris. The amount of climate change we could get by 2030, a little time into the future, and by the end of this century, 2100. And this is amount of change in degrees C, and you can see that warming is not evenly spread around the globe. We warm more in the poles than we do in the equator, more on land than we do in the ocean. So for example, if you look here in our section of North America, it wouldn't be surprising if under a business as usual, if we don't follow Paris, we could get upwards of 5.5 degrees C warmer than we're accustomed to. To biology, that is a big amount of difference. And I illustrate that in this next slide. If you look at the last time the Earth was about 6 degrees cooler, so the same amount of difference than we could have by 2100, ecology was very different all around the globe. And an example here, I'm depicting this with my picture on the left-hand side. I want to talk about a place that maybe some of us know. It's Death Valley, California. This picture's not from Death Valley, but maybe it will elicit for you a response of what you might know about Death Valley, which is a very hot and dry place. The middle picture is of an evergreen music forest. That's what Death Valley was like at the end of the last ice age, when the climate was cooler. So between then and now, all of the species that we associate with Death Valley have moved in an entirely different suite of species adapted to warmer and drier climates than the species that lived there when the temperature was 6 degrees cooler. Another biology example here, I show a relative of a crocodile or an alligator. The last time that CO2 concentration was comparable to what we have now and the climate was equilibrated, which was tens of millions of years ago, there was a relative of the alligator living at the poles. So whatever thoughts you might have about what climate is supposed to be like, or what kinds of organisms are supposed to live in Minnesota or anywhere around the world, if this amount of change happens, 6 degrees C, think completely differently. And even under the 2 degrees C goal of Paris, we wouldn't be surprised to see something quite a bit different. Biology cares a lot when the climate changes. Now, what does biology do typically? What has it done in the past when the climate has changed? Because the climate has always changed. This is just what the climate change we're experiencing now is more rapid and has a new cause. But we can look to the past to see what happens when how biology has responded under past climate change. And the dominant response, at least when you look in the fossil record, is that things move. All of the species that we do associate with Minnesota, for example, as this picture demonstrates, we were very close to the ice sheet here at the peak of the last ice age. So species that we associate with this part of the world were actually pushed further down into the southeast. And as that ice sheet receded, the species shifted their ranges further to the north. So they moved as the climate changed. Now, not every species probably moved when the climate changed, and we have an imperfect record of what happens here because the fossil record tends to be dominated by species that are quite common and widespread. But we have an expectation from the historic record that when the climate changes, things move. So that makes it a reasonable thing to do to try to make predictions about where things might likely move in the future. And this slide is an example for sugar maple. This is on the left-hand side of this slide. You'll find a model that is built with current occupancy data. So the colors show different densities of sugar maple under our current climate, or the climate to which sugar maple has been experiencing or has been equilibrated in the recent past. On the right-hand side of this slide is a projection. So you take the climatic niche of where that species tends to occur, the climates where you would find it today, and you simply ask the computer to tell you where will those climates exist in the future. So those bright red and orange colors show where sugar maple will exist in the future. Now in this picture it actually looks like it falls off the map. In fact, there's Canada to the north. My point here is if you associate sugar maple with good portions of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, it's likely to be quite uncommon in those areas in the future. Now, when species moved in the past, or that assumption about sugar maple moving in the future, assumes that those organisms can get from one spot to another. And perhaps sugar maple they can, because it has a fairly widespread distribution, or because seeds might readily disperse, let's say. But for the most part, we would expect that under a modern climate change, there will be many more barriers to dispersal than there were, say, during the end of the last ice age. And this picture is attempting to show that. This is a picture of different land uses, land cover categories. And for example, in our part here of the Midwest, you can see the dominant form of agriculture. So it's hard to imagine lots of creatures, say forest species or native prairie species, moving easily across this heavily modified landscape. So that suggests not only is the cause of climate change now different than the climate changes we've had in the future, but our landscape is fundamentally different as well. So we should consider this when we think about the capacity of species to move on their own. Oh, in fact, on this slide, I point out an example of a species from the fossil record that we think did not successfully migrate and went extinct. This is a spruce Picea critchfieldii, but there are not very many examples in the fossil record of species failing to migrate. Our concern is that there could be many more species in the modern record that are not able to track changing climatic conditions. And they may decline, they might go locally extinct, or if we're not careful, they might go globally extinct, and that reduces total biodiversity. Biodiversity that might be important to us economically, biodiversity that might be important to us as stewards of the resources of our state, and that might matter to us aesthetically, and for a whole suite of reasons. We'd be concerned about changes in our ecosystem form and function, and also the species that we associate with our region. So now we can start to break this down a little bit more. Which species do we think are likely to have difficulties under climate change? This is a concept that in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, across all different sectors of society, we consider this idea of vulnerability. And we can think about vulnerability for biodiversity, or for forest species, or for whatever living thing that concerns us. And that vulnerability is a function of three key ingredients. The first ingredient is exposure. Exposure is how much climate change will actually happen. So our exposure in Minnesota is dictated by our position on the globe, and it's determined by how much greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere. Maybe 2 degrees C if we follow the Paris Agreement, perhaps more if we do not. The second ingredient is sensitivity. That says how much does that exposure actually matter. It might mean how much does that exposure matter to our economy, or it might mean how much does that exposure, say, matter to a species. How sensitive is it to that climatic change? And then the third ingredient is adaptive capacity, and that is what resources or abilities does a species or an ecosystem, or even humans, have to reduce that sensitivity or that exposure, to undo some of its otherwise vulnerability. This concept of adaptive capacity for natural resources and for living things is largely unknown. We know what kinds of stuff is in it, but we have much to learn about how to encourage it or manipulate adaptive capacity. But in general, when we think about the adaptive capacity of creatures, of plants and animals, and even in many respects of ecosystems, there are really three fundamental things that a species can do or could happen. The first is some kind of phenotypic plasticity. So the organism, through maybe by adjusting its phenology or its body size or some sort of physiological adjustment or morphological change, it just tolerates it in situ by living differently in place. Phenotypic plasticity. Another, which I already suggested is a dominant response in the fossil record, is to move, geographic range change. And the third possibility is some sort of evolutionary process, which we might be skeptical that there will be much evolution in response to modern climate change because modern climate change is so fast. But where there is existing genetic variation, it's possible that we could see fairly rapid evolution. The question is, do those traits for tolerance currently already exist in a population of interest? So we know a little bit about organisms' phenotypic plasticity, but we could know a lot more. So as natural resource managers or as stewards of biodiversity, these are three ingredients that we need to think about. Potentially we can foster or manage for in order to increase the adaptive capacity of systems to deal with their exposure, at least for in the ways that they might be sensitive. So this adaptive capacity idea is really important for us to think about when we're confronting climate change. Now this is a bit of a busy slide. This actually comes from a recent paper that's come out by some colleagues and myself, but I want to make a point here about adaptive capacity and how I think it's useful for managers to think about adaptive capacity. Now, in ecology, we often talk about these ideas of the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the fundamental niche is this idea that an organism has a lifestyle. It has a certain set of conditions under which it can live. And we can reveal an organism's fundamental niche by growing it alone with an abundance of resources. But in nature, things tend to be constrained to their realized niche because they're interacting with other species, because resources are in short supply. So they're never getting a chance in nature to express their full selves. We think we can take this idea of realized and fundamental and think of it in terms of adaptive capacity as well. So in this green blob I've shown on this slide, imagine this being a realized adaptive capacity. This is an adaptive capacity amount that, say, a species is able to demonstrate out in nature right now. The fundamental adaptive capacity is some theoretical possible extent of adaptive capacity. And as managers, if we want to reduce that vulnerability, we might think about wanting to increase that adaptive capacity more toward that theoretical fundamental possible amount. So here I've shown these two blobs along two axes. One is an evolution axis and another is a dispersal axis. So these are two dimensions of adaptive capacity. So we could say, how could we increase, and this is what the arrows are intended to represent, how could we increase realized adaptive capacity, say, along the axis of adaptive evolution? We might be able to affect that, say, by some genetic mixing or breeding to increase the potential for this organism to evolve and reduce its vulnerability. And how could we increase the adaptive capacity along the dispersal axis? Well, that might encourage us to make habitats more connected to one another so that an organism has a greater possibility of moving as a way of responding adaptively to a climate change scenario. So I think this concept of what is constraining the adaptive capacity of my species or my system in nature, and what can we do in a management context to try to release or increase that adaptive capacity so that an organism has the greatest opportunity to thrive in the face of this climate change. Now, let's take a moment then and say, okay, I suggested a couple of strategies here, genetic mixing, habitat connectivity, for example. But what are actually strategies that are available to us? There would be a whole menu of options, potentially, things that we could do when we're thinking about this adaptive capacity or reducing vulnerability of species and ecosystems to climate change. Now, I list on this slide 5, and I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. But before we do go through those 5, I want to simply point out that when we think about management under climate change, we in fact have 2 general things that we can do. Firstly, we should ask ourselves whether what we are managing for is still possible. Or should we adjust our goals? For example, is it still possible to manage this forest as a forest? Or do we need to think about managing it as a savanna, for example? Or is it possible that this will be habitat for an endangered species going forward? Or do we need to think about another location for our conservation of our endangered species? That would be changing your goals. Once you've thought about how your goals fit with climate change and the amount of climate change you anticipate, you can then think about what kinds of strategies are appropriate to achieve those goals. And I think it's important to recognize that goals and strategies are distinctive from one another. So I think of strategies as sort of tools in your toolbox. So once you've decided what you're going to build, now you need to use some tools. So some of the tools, most important tools perhaps, or the ones that are most intuitive to us in the toolbox, are traditional conservation tools. Controlling invasive species, setting aside parks and preserves, things that we already know how to do and that we have historically thought of as often win-win situations. Now, there is some reason, however, to be concerned about the suitability of this traditional conservation approaches. Are they up to the task? And I illustrate this simply by showing a map in North America of national parks. So if you were going to use parks and preserves as your primary way of managing biodiversity under climate change, so sort of thinking about that adaptive capacity, the amount of land presently dictated to parks and preserves is somewhat limited. Again, this is just the National Park Service. But the point is there's a lot more land that's not in a park than there is. But it's important to think about what tools do we already know how to use that we can use to help increase that adaptive capacity. And land conservation might be one of them. A second strategy in the toolbox we call strategic resistance. This strategic resistance idea is basically one of gardening, you might think. Fighting against what would otherwise, a change that would otherwise happen. And my example that I like to use comes from a paper several years ago on Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park. This map shows the predicted locations of Joshua Tree under climate change. The X on this map marks the location of Joshua Tree National Park, and I show here a picture also of Joshua Tree. Joshua Tree National Park you'll see that X is sitting in a red spot. That red spot means a model, like the one I showed earlier for sugar maple, suggests that Joshua trees will not be able to grow there in the future. Green spots and yellow spots are places where the model predicts Joshua trees will grow in the future. So what should we do about the fact that Joshua trees might not grow in Joshua Tree National Park? Well, there's some evidence to suggest that one of the reasons why Joshua trees might not grow well in Joshua Tree National Park might have to do with, say, seedling survival or drought resistance. So it might be possible through very intensive management to foster the survival of individual seedlings, so that just in that place where you're doing that strategic resistance, you could have Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park. In contrast to fighting against change, another possible strategy, one that's has been somewhat controversial, is the idea of managed relocation, or you may have heard assisted migration. Colleagues and I have preferred to call it managed relocation for a variety of reasons that you can find in the papers that we write, but we can also think of it as assisted migration or assisted colonization. I put in here this cartoon that was published in the Boston Globe several years ago when they wrote a story about the idea of managed relocation. It shows exactly the idea, which is a human moving moving a creature over a dispersal barrier, in this case, the San Francisco Bay, in order to help that creature move to a new location where it's predicted to survive in the future under climate change. So it is an intervention technique. It's something in the toolbox aimed to reduce the negative effects of climate change on a species, on a genotype, on some ecobiological unit, taking it from where you think it's unlikely to persist or not persist well and move it where it is more likely to persist in the future. I showed this map previously, and I said red were areas where Joshua Tree was predicted not to be able to persist in the future. The yellow are areas where Joshua Tree is predicted to be able to exist under a certain climate scenario in a certain time frame, but it is able to disperse there on its own, so it's within the range of natural dispersal of Joshua trees. And I point to a big green spot on this map saying this could be an area where you might pursue assisted migration. So you could conserve or even potentially increase, in some cases, Joshua tree populations by putting them in new locations where they haven't existed before. I just want to, for a moment, have some interesting results to share of some surveys that we did recently on assisted migration, managed relocation, because it is such a controversial idea. Some of the things we listed previously in this items in the toolbox we're more used to. Managed relocation is an idea that really hasn't come about except when thinking about how to manage under climate change. So we have a new paper where we report results of surveys. We ask published scientists what do they think about managed relocation, and interestingly, they're mostly neutral about it. A small percentage, just if you ask them in general, how supportive are they of managed relocation as a concept? Very few of them say they are strongly support it, and very few of them say they do not support it at all, suggesting that more work to be done about this, but uncertainty in the scientific community about what managed relocation might mean. In fact, just one more fact about that survey, when we asked those experts specific cases about managed relocation, so we asked them in 3 particular vignettes. We asked them about an endangered butterfly that was likely to go extinct under climate change. We asked them about an ecosystem service, a timber or forest species that wasn't going to go extinct under climate change, but you could benefit from moving into new locations. And we asked a sort of complicated question. We asked about corals, but what if you actually, to benefit corals, move the symbiont of corals called zooxanthellae? And here in this slide, I just show the results when you ask individuals how justified, effective, whether they would support or if it was beneficial doing managed relocation in each of these cases. And I simply want to point out that each case elicits a different answer. So the black bars are across the board relatively high. Percentage of respondents say endangered butterfly, justified, probably would be effective and they would support it. Less justifiable and less support for timber, but probably would work. And the opposite for the corals. Perhaps justified, they might support it, but they think it would be less effective, perhaps because of those more complicated ecological interactions. In the previous slide, our takeaway was this neutrality and lack of certainty about what managed relocation might mean. Our takeaway from this result is the scientists really seeing that managed relocation might be context dependent. So thinking about there could be circumstances in which it's appropriate and might work, and other circumstances where it may definitely not be. 4th strategy, build corridors. Connect up habitats to allow species to migrate on their own. We talked about this earlier in our adaptive capacity slide, that by connecting habitats together, we might facilitate that natural adaptive capacity of movement. However, the size of the corridor is going to have to vary with the amount of climate change. A lot of climate change means really, really big corridors, hundreds of, or possibly thousands of kilometers. So it's difficult to think about corridors in some respects. So for example, in this slide we show a simple plot of corn production by county. How would we imagine making effective corridors for some species through the agricultural Midwest? On the other hand, we do have resources available to us, and my example here is the National Refuge System, which is somewhat spread widely across the landscape. But there might be strategic ways of thinking about linking those up into larger corridors and connected networks that could be effective for some kinds of species. And lastly, it's important to think about, and many natural resource managers on the ground tend not to think about this tool in the toolbox, but that's ex situ conservation. The fact that you could remove something altogether from nature and put it in the freezer or store it in a zoo because managed relocation might be possible in the future, or reintroduction, or some other traditional conservation tool might become appropriate in the future. And you just want to simply save that biodiversity. And there are a number of these efforts ongoing. The Millennium Seed Bank Project, for example, is aiming to collect seeds around the globe, or Seeds of Success is the analog here in North America. Or in some cases, this is an oryx living in Texas that is entirely endangered in the wild. But just for the sake of preserving that genetic stock, we do have parks or preserves where these species are held for some unknown possible use. It might be a possible last resort for preserving biodiversity that we're fearful we could lose altogether. And then I just want to point out one last thing, because I have spent so much time talking about species, individual species, and thinking about adaptive capacity of species. We need to also think about species assemblages. And here again, we can look at the historic record. And when we do look at the historic record, we know that we will see combinations of species that are different in the future than they have been in the past. That's what happened last time the climate changed quite a bit. And this picture shows that. That big white blob is the extent of the ice sheet. And this is coming out of the last ice age, showing descriptions of forest type. And what you'll see at various times, especially the further you go back in time, is this red blob, which is what we call a no analog forest. So it's a combination of species for which we don't have a name. We wouldn't call it deciduous forest or prairie. It was some novel contribution that it has no analog today. I think when we look to the future, we should expect that we'll have those no analog situations again, and we'll need to be able to understand how to manage them and whether or not they'll be acceptable for our management objectives. And lastly, I think it's also worth talking about how much turnover we might expect to see if we're in a particular spot. Many of us, the way natural resource and biodiversity management works is we are associated with particular geography. So you might think about things sort of moving and changing over top of our geography. And this picture demonstrates that point. This is a study that came out several years ago. Each one of those pixels shows you how much percentage turnover there would be in the composition of the species. So the darker the color, it says the higher the percentage of species is different. I believe this is a business as usual scenario. This is built for birds, mammals, and amphibians. In some cases, you can see the color is so dark that the composition of species turns over completely and then turns over again. But in many parts of North America, we'd expect to see species compositions for vertebrates, for example, that might be 40–50% different than we're accustomed to. Again, novel communities, different combinations of species. We need to ask ourselves, how does that affect our management objectives and the strategies that we use? So I'll end by just highlighting a few points that I think are important to think about when confronting. I began with the grand coming together in Paris that maybe we can agree on capping our emissions and allowing only 2 degrees C of warming. However, I also indicated that we are only halfway there to 2 degrees C of warming. 2 degrees C of warming is quite a bit of climate change. So all of the droughts and extreme events that we have seen increase in frequency already, and the steady warming, for example, that we've been experiencing in Minnesota, the Paris Agreement would have that continue for at least another decade. I talked about this idea of adaptive capacity, and I want to say adaptive capacity is our friend. Think about what it is in the organisms that you manage and how you can foster and promote it. I discussed how climate change forces us to examine both the strategies that are available to us in our conservation toolbox, and also invites us to think whether we should be changing our goals, if our objectives are still viable given the amount of climate change we're experiencing. I talked about that we should anticipate novel communities and considerable turnover in species composition. And I'd like to end by saying that though I gave a list of possible strategies, I think there's an extraordinary opportunity for innovation. It's a profound challenge that we face. However, we can also think creatively, and it gives us, in a strange way, an opportunity to really probe what it is that's most important about the conservation that we're trying to achieve, and think about new ways we might go about achieving it. Perhaps we could even build new connections between some of the residents of our state and the wildlife that exists within it.